You might be familiar with the baking competition show, The Great British Bake Off. And if you are, you might know the name Jürgen Kraus. He was a fan favorite in the 2021 series, and he is probably best known for his accolade-winning baking masterpieces. But he also plays a trombone. In fact, during the COVID-19 lockdowns, he, his son, and his neighbor got together to play trombone music from the 16th century. But in the 16th century, the trombone wasn't yet the trombone. At that time, it was called the sackbut.
Whoa!
Now, you might be intrigued by the sackbut's name, and you wouldn't be the first. Sackbut comes from the Old French Sackbut. Sack means pull, and but means push, so the name of the instrument literally means pull, push. Because that's the action the sackbut player makes while playing it. Other names for the sackbut include Sackbut, shackbushes, psychebuts, and yes, shackbuts. The sackbut comes from 15th century Burgundy, France. It's a brass instrument, and unlike the modern trombone, it has thicker walls and a narrower bell, which give it a softer tone. Here's the sackbut. And here's the trombone. The sackbut you just heard was an alto sackbut. Like the trombone, the sackbut comes in multiple sizes and each one sounds different. Here's an example of the tenor sackbut, which is lower than the alto sackbut we heard before. And here's an example of the bass sackbut. It's much lower than both the alto and tenor sackbuts. So, who was playing the sackbut? People who played the sackbut tended to be town musicians, or Stadtpfeifers. They played instruments common to the 16th century, like shawms, cornets, and the sackbut, in town squares or from clock towers to announce the time or to raise the alarm. While many sackbut players were Stadtpfeifers, others were court musicians, and court musicians were pretty well treated for 16th century musicians. In Henry VIII's 1532 court, 11 of roughly 60 of them were sackbut players. This manuscript also lists the court musicians' pay, and we can see that sackbut players were paid the most out of all the court musicians. This is particularly striking for the time, because other types of musicians were sometimes looked down upon. Traveling musicians were sometimes even feared, because they were, at times, known to act as political spies for well-paying patrons as side hustles. Many of the great works from the Baroque time period, like Monteverdi's Vespers of 1610, include distinctive sackbut parts. But as we moved out of the Baroque period and into the Classical period, the use of the sackbut began to decline. The last known Baroque scoring for the sackbut occurred in 1739, in one of Georg Friedrich Handel's opera, Saul. By that time, Handel already considered the sackbut an ancient instrument, and quite ironically, the piece in that opera that the sackbuts were used in was called the Dead March. From that point forward, the French horn gradually overtook the sackbut in popularity. It's not clear exactly why, but it might be because, during the Renaissance, there wasn't much distinction made between different types of horns in performance. So, If at one point the two were viewed as interchangeable, it's possible that the French horn's role got intermingled with the sackbuts. But either way, in the 19th century, the French horn began to take on its own orchestral role, and the trombone emerged as the true replacement of the sackbut. The sackbut had a smaller bell than the trombone would, and it had leather pieces to cushion the slide when it came into first position. Because the first positions on some sackbuts were too far extended for most sackbut players' arms, they also had a handle on the slide to extend the reach. The position of the tuning mechanism was also different. On the sackbut, the tuning mechanism was near the mouthpiece, whereas the trombones was at the back of the tubing. But the primary difference between the sackbut and the trombone is probably the placement of the bell itself. The sackbut's bell was loose and it fell at the slide's fourth position, which gave it a more resonant, rich sound. The trombone's bell, on the other hand, is closer to the player, at third position, and it's soldered firmly in place. This gives the trombone a louder, more powerful sound. As a result of this more powerful sound, the trombone became a staple of the highly dramatic music of the Romantic era, including that of Richard Wagner, Gustav Mahler, and Maurice Ravel. For example, here's the trombone solo from Ravel's Bolero. Between the classical era and the late 20th century, the sackbut largely fell out of common use. But in the late 20th century, the early music movement, which is made of people who take a great interest in Renaissance and Baroque music, began to take shape in response to increasingly modern conventions, and interest in early instruments reignited. One of the most famous ensembles playing early music is the Newberry Consort, which Jürgen Kraus has even played the sackbut for. Today, you can find all sorts of recordings of the sackbut, in both solo and ensemble settings. Give them a listen. Are there other instruments you'd like to see us do a video about? Drop a comment down below and let us know.